is the great show for the people.
Jake, do you remember the haunted toilet by chance?
As with everything that happens in that city, I vaguely recall.
Taylor, have you ever heard this story?
I have not, no.
Okay, so UFC 162, Silva Weidman won. We go out with a bunch of guys to Vegas for the fight. There's like 5 of us packed in this hotel room.
Sounds right.
Totally ridiculous. So we get there, staying at the hotel at Mandalay Bay. As usual, our room's not ready. And so we get put, after quite a bit of time, we get put in a handicap room. And we walk in, we're like, okay, whatever. It's the bigger bathroom. We're like, all right, we'll take the victory, handicap accessible. We got it. So we walk in there, we're fine. We deal with it. 5 guys, you get the extra mattress. Well, that night, overnight, we're all sleeping, our alcohol-fueled sleep. And in our slumber, we hear very loud noises coming from the bathroom. So we walk in there and we look, we're like, what the fuck is going on? And we look and the toilet is just like bubbling over in the middle of the night. And it would just like periodically bubble up and make these crazy noises.
I do recall it was full-blown Ghostbusters because we hear these noises and you wake up and you're looking around like, oh shit, is someone like in trouble?
Was a handicapped person killed in that bathroom?
And we were like, again, it's the 5 guys. So you're like, if anybody was in there, just own up to it. We don't give a shit. We just want to make sure this thing's not fucking haunted.
Who destroyed the bathroom?
That trip ended with like us sending like random Chris Benoit. You remember how dark that room got by the last night? So like it was like, and then there was one like Agatha Christie, because like all of our friends slowly left, and then like the last night I think it was like me, you, and Hayes, and we were like started getting like stir crazy, and we're just like sending out Chris Benoit pictures to our friends. This is obviously post murder suicide. So things got so dark in that room. It was actually the last time we ever stayed at Mandalay Bay. So
there's 2 follow-ups to that. One, I distinctly recall our friend Hayes, who was there, being in line at some food place, and he sparks up a conversation with like one guy who could definitely help us out with this phantom toilet issue. Like it was like the director of something other. Yeah.
I remember this. So we're literally sitting at the food court at the Luxor, and we're talking about how like, man, we got to let Mandalay hear it. This hotel room is haunted. This is horrible. And we're like, Hayes is taking a while up there for getting his food. What's going on? He comes back. We're like, dude, who was that guy? He was like talking to some guy, and he was like the VP of customer relations for MGM. And we're like, oh, cool. Did you tell him about our room? And he's like, nah, I forgot. What do you mean you forgot, dude?
Did you mention this terrible experience we've been having for the past 3 days?
Fucking room's haunted.
That is the most Hayes thing I've ever heard. Did he have 2 pretzels in his hand when he approached
probably like
you?
3 hot dogs and a sandwich.
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's get to our episode. This is MMA Untold. The man you heard from was the Godfather there telling the story, and the man who vaguely remembered that story was Mr. Jake Copeland, the fire starter.
Blame it on Vegas.
And I am Taylor Gabriel. So today we are covering part 3 of our 3-part series on Anderson Silva. In part 1, we covered the rise of the Spider. In part 2, the reign, and now we'll wrap Silva's story up with the fall. So when we last left our hero, he had just completed a...
Are we calling him a hero?
Yeah, I'm calling him a hero.
Go
Spider-Man, man. Come on.
True. All right.
So when we last left him, he had just wrapped up a 6.5-year-long winning streak in the UFC, including 16 consecutive wins, 3 of them at light heavyweight, and 11 of them, if you count the Travis Lutter fight, middleweight title defenses. So now, Silva had cleaned out his division multiple times, and talks of boxing matches, super fights, and a permanent division move were being discussed. But in the meantime, Silva had to keep defending his belt. So after a long, strange shakeout of competitors, one man stood between Silva and another notch to his legacy. That man, or boy as Silva would refer to him, was armed with more than just the skills to match Silva's own. Unlike most of Silva's previous opponents, Chris Weidman carried with him not only confidence, but a strict game plan.
Going into this fight, I mean, it was they had pulled a classic UFC. They had put Weidman on a bunch of the, the classic UFC on Fuel TV and basically hidden him away. They did put him on a UFC on Fox. I think it was in Chicago. We got to see him. Pretty late notice there, but they didn't do a good job of letting the world know who he was. And this is the classic UFC curse. I mean, this is like when Amanda Nunes ends up dethroning all the greatest women of all time. People still don't know who she is. The UFC was hiding him. And here he comes, and Silva is like you said, he's talking about all these super fights. And then people get what they consider, the casual fan is like, well, who the fuck is this guy? And the mainstream, these mainstream people want the Roy Jones fight. They want these GSP fights. That's what everybody wants, and that's what Silva seems to want too, as he's talking about he's alluding to, isn't Roy Jones at this fight? I think he's there.
Yeah,
right?
I believe he was, actually.
He's there. The GSP thing, he's trying to make that happen. So Weidman was kind of the least attractive option for a lot of people, but in the build, all the pros picks, Joe Rogan's, the people like that were saying like, hey, don't sleep on Weidman. This is very serious. And look no further than Vegas. The odds were like 2-1. Silva was like a 2-1 favorite. Granted, you'd be like, oh, it's a heavy favorite. Not in a Silva fight. At this time, I can't remember specifically. I want to say Silva was running around usually minus 600, minus 500.
I want to say there was one fight, and I don't remember who it was, where he was minus 1,000.
Yep. So there you go. So this is your major red flag that Vegas knows something's up. If the greatest of all time, and this is coming off of the Bonner destruction, he's minus 200 to a guy that a lot of people didn't know. He's only 8-0 or something at this point. I think
he was 8-0 or 9-0, and I said there was a bunch of strange events with the other contenders, because this was when Hector Lombard had come over. And he had a great record coming over, but he loses his first fight. He loses another fight. I think Bisping was in talks at this point, and he got injured or something happened with one of his fights. Alan Belcher. There was a number of people, and every contender either lost their way out of a fight with Anderson Silva or got injured. And so they put in Chris Weidman, who was nowhere near the top at this point. Well, I shouldn't say nowhere near. He was not even in the conversation initially until all of these things happened. And then all of a sudden, that's who they were left with. So Silva's like, who is this kid with less than 10 fights? I've got 30 fights.
Yep. And at the time, it's too early or someone hasn't been promoted correctly when half the damn ads were other fighters just saying, like, this guy can beat Anderson. But it was like, it wasn't forced. They believed it. Well, we've spent the better part of 3 hours kind of building this blueprint for how to beat Anderson over his career. Each fighter was kind of pulling a piece of how to do it. And when you get a fighter like Weidman with a camp like Longo Serra, heading into this, they're super dangerous. And we were fired up. I don't mean to ramble here, but so we joked in the beginning, we went to this fight. And Jake, you were there, if you recall.
Was I?
And it was a classic fight week. It's the classic thing with the UFC we talk about, where we went all the way to Vegas, did not buy tickets. We waited until the very end because what are we worried about? Injuries, issues on the scales, and we're like, fuck it, we're not paying $300 for a ticket when the main event's gonna possibly not happen. We literally waited until the day before, and all of our friends dropped out, and Jake, you and I went. We got them on StubHub. We had to go pick them up because it was the day before.
I do recall that.
Remember that? You were super on the DL, as I recall, super hungover. We have to pay a premium? Yep, but we knew we were going to get to see the fights we wanted to. We paid over the price for our tickets. I think we paid a couple $100 more, whatever, but I have no regrets because, again, we would lose way more over time if we bought fucking tickets to every event. Went to the fight, well worth it, fucking out of control.
So I definitely recall one of my clearest memories of that time in my life is when we were discussing getting the tickets, because like you said, everyone else dropped out and we were talking about it. And you mentioned the word blueprint earlier, and that definitely got thrown out a lot during that conversation about buying the tickets. Was like, listen, like this guy, the people in the know are saying like this guy might be the guy who's just the right puzzle piece fit to win, and that really spurred our decision, and it was a great one.
Yeah, I mean, we were nervous as fuck, but I mean, going into this seemed like it had all the rest of the indicators of a recipe for disaster for Silva. And I mean, if you want to go over the fight round by round, I mean, it's a short fight.
Go over it really quick.
So Yeah, I mean, the first round, Weidman comes out, and again, full disclosure here, guys, I tried to rewatch the fights, but I had to tell everyone here that I was going to be in a weird headspace if I did this. I could not go down that road because things have gone a little south with Weidman recently, and I was like, I can't do this. So I am going to work off memory here, but right off the bat in the first round, Weidman was in control, looking good. I think he secures a takedown pretty quick, but he's in control. All Anderson's able to muster up is some leg kicks, which is important to note for later. He gets some leg kicks in. But so we're feeling great. Jake, we're fired up because Weidman's looking good. Towards the end of the round, though, if I'm remembering correctly, because again, I didn't watch it, it felt like Silva might have been getting in his head a little bit. It just felt like the taunting, like Weidman was starting to swing a little wild. And I remember in between rounds, we were nervous.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think there's a world where you enter a fight with, as a fan of anyone fighting Silva, where you're not nervous. Like, I don't want that to get lost in it. Like, he's the most dangerous dude on the planet at the time. But yeah, we were nervous. And if you recall, Weidman's aunt was like right in front of us.
Up.
Yeah,
yes,
so,
I do.
So Weidman's aunt was right there, and she was just flipping out. But yeah, she was super nervous. We were nervous. 15 feet behind us, Chael in DC may or may not have been nervous. So yeah, it was
crazy. So little did we know that in between rounds, Longo may have noticed a similar thing that we had, that maybe Weidman was getting wrapped up in the games and basically told him to like punch down the middle, basically punch a fucking hole in his stomach. Or what does he say? Something about punching a hole in his fucking stomach, or basically telling him, don't get caught up in bullshit, punch down the middle.
Yeah, straight through him.
Yep, straight through him. And boy, round 2 starts, Anderson's clowning around. As we talked about in part 2. Is he clowning around just to showboat? Maybe. Is he trying to get Weidman to engage? We don't know. But he starts clowning around, and it gets a little bit out of control, and Weidman fucking catches him in the middle of this weird-ass thing that he's doing.
Yeah, let me just paint that picture really quickly. You said that you felt like Silva was starting to gain a little bit of his momentum, and as an Anderson Silva fan watching it, I was used to the first round happening. I was used to that happening at this point, but I too thought, here we go. Silva's starting to get loose. Whenever Silva starts to loosen up and joke around, as a fan, you have seen that at that point, Silva's got his opponent figured out. And now he's just going to bait them into something, and he's going to finish the fight. So I was looking at it, okay, Silva's seen something, not Weidman. Silva has found something in Weidman's game, and he's going to get in his head. Weidman's going to throw some looping punch, and Silva's going to throw his punch straight down the middle and finish Weidman. Really, that's what I was expecting. And he's throwing good kicks, but Weidman catches him, backs up to reset, and that's when Silva starts wobbling and rolling his eyes back, faking like, oh, that punch hurt me. You really got me. But as he's doing that, Weidman decides to step forward and throw a 2 or 3 punch combo, and the third one catches Silva clean on the chin, and Silva doesn't see it coming because he's got his eyes closed, clowning around.
Fucking around.
And I'm sure 100% of the people listening to this have seen the fight, but he did the fake fall thing, and then he leans back again, and then he's got nowhere else to go when that third punch is thrown. He's got nowhere to go, and it just clips him.
Well, we'll save this for Weidman's episode. We don't want to go too far into the Weidman stuff, but that is really what's beautiful. A lot of times there are 2-punch combos, and Silva had dodged Forrest punches the exact same way. He had just stepped back, lean, and usually that's it. You get a 2-punch combo and the person resets. Weidman throws that third lunging one, and
we'll save it because he does mix up even the way he throws them, that's the thing. And that the message that we'll get to here, and what's important to take out of this fight is that A, they might have solved him. We'll go over that in the Weidman episode. They might have solved him, but B, the fluky ending. Okay, because that's the big takeaway, right? Everyone, the fight ends, and we're all ready to celebrate, all fired up, and people are like, he was clowning around. He got caught.
And look, we've seen it with other fighters. You don't take your opponent seriously. He's calling him a kid in the lead up. He's talking about boxing fights. He's talking about super fights. And he steps in there and he's goofing around and does not believe Chris Weidman has the ability to beat him. And he gets beat. So yeah, you're right. After the fight, I mean, you kind of have every reason on Anderson's side of things to go, well, he's never lost a fight like that before. Weidman caught him on the chin. He was goofing off too much. It was a fluke. Let's run it back.
Yep. And to your point, I'm sorry to go back into the fight, but it was one of the most surreal moments in my life being there when he fell, because you're like, no way. Like because he is clowning around. When he lands, you're like, no way that just happened. And then we're like looking at each other like he's down. You see Weidman's aunts going ballistic next to us crying. You turn around, Chael just has the biggest grin on his face in the world. And it didn't feel real. It did not feel real at all. All-time moment.
One of the craziest things I've ever experienced live, and mostly because of the crowd. So I've been to, I don't know, 6 probably cards or something throughout the years. And I don't know if anyone's ever experienced like a huge knockout or whatever, but there were so many people in that place. And when that hit, there was a literal vacuum because everyone breathed in at the same time.
Yep.
And there was just a split second of quiet and everyone breathed in. And there was a barometric pressure changed in this building we were in. And it was, I've never experienced that. That was crazy.
Here's a really far throwback, but our very first episode on this podcast, and it was just Zach and I at the time, we did Ken Shamrock and Hoist Gracie. And I remember Shamrock telling the story of the very first UFC when Gerard Gordeau kicks Tully in the face and his tooth goes flying into the front row. And him describing this similar thing, that everyone in the locker room is warming up and they're kind of looking at the crappy TV monitor, and boom, this kick happens and teeth go flying, and there's just this, everyone stops what they're doing, and there's like a 7-minute silence in this vacuum. And it sounds very similar because the two situations are the same. You are not expecting to see that. You're just not. You could have analyze that fight a million different ways, but to see the great Anderson Silva get just knocked out cold, I would have said, okay, Weidman maybe can go the Chael Sonnen route, ground and pound him out for 5 rounds. Maybe he can ground and pound him into a ref stoppage, but just a clean TKO was wild.
Yeah.
It was wild.
I think most people thought ground and pound submission, whatever, but that was crazy. So I want to ask you, we spent a lot of time talking about Jake and I's experience at the fight, and this does seem like an important moment here. So as a Silva fan, this is the fall. We're at the fall. This episode's the fall. This is the moment when it all fucking falls apart. How were you feeling about the fight? Were you nervous going into it, upset? Like how were you before it, and then how were you during and after?
Well, before it, I kind of was aggravated that Weidman was getting the shot because I didn't think he deserved it. I didn't care what the analysts were saying. I thought this is one of those fights where apparently his opponent is dangerous and there's really little upside to this. There's not really any upside. He's fighting a guy way down in contention, and if he wins, it feels like a Patrick Cote win. You know what I mean? Feels like a win, or a Talis Leides win, where people are like, just get him out of the division or fight somebody who's a real contender. Who's this 8-0? Who's this guy?
No one knew him.
So going into the fight, it really felt like, not like a trap fight, but it felt like a fight that just really didn't make a whole lot of sense. And then when that happens, it was the same thing on the other side. It was a shock and disbelief. And you're trying in your head to go, maybe he was injured. It was the similar thing that happened with the first Chael fight. You're like, something's wrong. No way that just happened. There has to be an explanation outside of Chris Weidman was just the better fighter. Because here's a guy who's never, ever really lost except way early in his career, losing to a guy that, quite frankly, didn't deserve to be in that spot. There's no way. Something's up. So then you're just waiting like, all right, we got to hear a post-fight press conference, and maybe it'll get revealed that Silva tore his ACL the day before or something. You know, there's got to be some excuse, but there wasn't. The excuse was Weidman was the better fighter. And everybody like me and like you watched in disbelief as Weidman ends Silva's run with that emphatic knockout.
Were you mad at the clowning around?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't only for the reason that he had done that in so many previous fights that I knew what the reason was for him doing that. Maybe I thought he took it a little too far. I think I was mad at that last sequence where he was overselling it.
Yeah.
You know? And I certainly feel if he hadn't, because here's what we can say. Weidman won the fight. He was the better fighter. But if Silva had not stood in one spot thinking he could just lean back and dodge Weidman's punches, the fight would have gone on. Weidman won, but there's no doubt that Silva's antics played into it being a finish at that moment. If he had just stepped back and reset, Weidman wouldn't have knocked him out right there. That's just a reality.
No,
maybe it would have happened the next round. Maybe it would have been a decision. Who knows what would have happened? But yes, he overdid it. So I guess I was aggravated in that sense that the fight didn't go further, certainly.
Now, before we move on from that fight, just a quick reminder for everybody, for all the new listeners, we don't like to break fights down like that. We don't normally go on for 15, 20 minutes, but this is one of the most historic fights of all time, maybe the greatest fighter of all time. There's a lot to digest here, and we didn't want to just blow through and be like, Weidman knocked him out, on to the next one. This is something you should remember, because this now is going to cause a 5-year spiral that we're still dealing with.
This is the first domino, so it needs to be addressed.
It's a historic moment. It was crazy to be there. I remember texting you that night, Taylor, going through all the emotions, because Weidman ends up becoming my favorite fighter probably ever from that night. This is beating your favorite fighter and creating this crazy feud. So it's an amazing moment, and we didn't want to just, because sometimes we feel like we don't give the fight some of the respect they deserve. This was an all-timer. Go ahead.
I do want to, I don't know if you remember tweeting that night.
I do. I said, I believe,
11:32 p.m.
Can I guess?
Yep.
Ding dong, the witch is dead.
Hashtag UFC 162. Yeah, that definitely happened. And it also ties into your wife's obsession with Wizard of Oz. So there's a great synchronicity
the fact
going
that
on.
you remember a tweet from almost 6 years ago, and Jake couldn't remember what he did yesterday tells a lot about this podcast. I love it. So after that emphatic knockout, in which the end had come decisively, many questioned whether Weidman had actually won the fight or Silva had simply lost it. So naturally, whenever a champion who has held the title as long as Silva loses, an immediate rematch is given. But Silva didn't seem all that interested.
Anderson, would you like to have a rematch with Chris Weidman? No. Chris is the champion now. Chris, I need you. All the people tonight, I need you to respect Chris. Chris is the best. That's it. I finished my working. I don't fight more for the belt. I changed my life now because I working hard for a long time. I have the belt for a long time. I'm tired. I relax now. I back for my family. Chris is new champion. Chris, I need you to respect people. That's it.
I hear 100% relief in that interview. That is a man who had a lot of weight on his shoulders, and I'm not saying he wanted to lose or anything like that, but man, that's relief. Like, it's over. I can just go about being a good fighter, and I don't have to focus on being the greatest fighter of all time.
Dude, you literally took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say the exact same thing. That is, for a guy that has this weird history of wearing masks or not being sincere, he's this big mystery. That's the most honest thing I've ever heard him say. You can hear it in his voice. He is relieved. I think that title had weighed on him for a long time. That's a ton of pressure for somebody that has to play it cool for 6-7 years. And it's over. It's just done. It's like the finishing a big project in school or a big project at work or a busy season. That relief. And did it end the way he wanted it to? No, but it's over. And he gets to fucking breathe.
It's amazing when you think about the psychology, when you hear of these people like presidents getting elected and then their term is done and then they go into this state of depression because they've reached the top of the mountain. Rashad talked about it in an old interview where he worked his whole life and got on the Ultimate Fighter and won it, and then got into the UFC and got all the way up to the top of the mountain, won the belt, and then he goes home the next day and it's quiet.
He said he thought it would be different.
Yeah, he thought it would be different, and it wasn't. So you have Anderson get to the top of the mountain, win it, sustain it all those years. Then he's aiming for glory in Brazil. He front kicks Vitor in the face. He becomes the Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, they were saying, of Brazil at the time. He's everywhere. He's got the Nike sponsorship at this point. And you're right. I mean, everything is weighing on him, and you have to, we talk about it in this sport all the time. There's no off days. You show up to a fight injured nearly every time you go to fight. You have to have all of your energy, all of your ducks in a row, and you have to be ready to take on a guy who now has built up their whole life for that moment. And you have to stop them every single time. And 16 consecutive times he had done that. And now he loses. And you're right. It's just this gigantic weight, this gigantic pressure off of him.
People get stressed out at their jobs. If they have a tough project for a week, they don't want to let their boss down. If they're upper management, they don't want to let their employees down. If you have a podcast or a TV show or you do stand-up, you don't want to let your fans down. Well, Anderson Silva didn't want to let like an entire country down. And that is a ton of fucking pressure to have for 6.5 years. Imagine the pressure you feel at your school or your job or whatever project you're working on. He had to make these people proud for that long. That's fucking tough, man.
I'm glad you mentioned the fans and the countrymen, because at that fight, I don't want to backtrack, but at that fight, it seemed like half of the people at that fight were Brazilian.
Yeah.
It was in that stadium, like they were loud and raucous, and there were a million Brazilian flags, and they were so proud and happy to see their guy fight. And it was kind of beautiful. Like
yes.
it was remarkable to see them, and to the point where like as we were leaving, like we were high, like we were on a high. We just witnessed this thing, and we were trying to talk about it, and we ended up like dropping our voices a couple times because people were devastated leaving that place, and we didn't want to rub it in because they had lost something.
Well, and you think about, the poverty there. It could, who knows what they sacrificed to make it there, to go to that fight, to fly across the world to see this. Those tickets were not cheap for anybody, whether you bought them from a scalper or on time. They come all the way there to see their hero lose. So you're right. We absolutely did want to keep it quiet.
One other note I want to make, because I watched just a few post-fight interviews before we began here. And in some of them, Silva uses a translator and speaks in Portuguese, and some of them he tries to speak English. Most of them, it's a little bit of both. But I was thinking about all the flack he gets for being able to, quote, speak English and not always speaking English in interviews, and thinking about my wife who speaks 2 languages but prefers one over the other. And I wonder, so he's getting all this pressure in terms of fighting. I wonder if he was also, if there's some pressure coming in from the Brazilian side to speak in Portuguese when he wins. You're a Brazilian fighter, represent your country, speak in Portuguese. Who gives a shit what Chael Sonnen says, that you know how to speak English and you're faking like you don't? Who cares about that guy? Speak in Portuguese, your native tongue, and represent Brazil.
Yeah.
Why are you trying to even speak English? I wonder. I don't know that to be the case, but we're talking about pressure. I just wonder if there's pressure on both sides. Speak English. You're in America. You know the language. Speak English. You're fighting in Las Vegas. Speak Portuguese. You're a Brazilian. You come from this country. You represent us. Who knows what kind of pressure is on this guy at this point? It's got to be outrageous.
And all the time away from his family, coming over here, doing the camps when he did them over here. I mean, just the whole thing has to be so much. You see it with all of them when GSP took a step back after the Johnny Hendricks fight. You can see they're just worn to the ground, man. So I think that's one of the most sincere things I've ever heard him say. Maybe the most sincere, honestly.
Yeah, but as many expected, Silva would eventually come around on the rematch, and he made sure that all who would tune in for the second fight around the world knew that the old Anderson Silva was back.
Yeah, guys, my fans and UFC and my fans in the world, in the United States. This Edmonton weight, I go back to fight Weidman and Anderson Silva. I back. Trust me, I back.
I love that. I back. Just gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Go ahead.
Well, what you can't see from the audio is him in the video winking after he says I back. It's just this sly grin and that wink.
Yeah.
Like he's hiding something,
We joke though, but leading into this rematch, so it was like 6 months. he was doing everything right, whether it's these little announcements or he was being super respectful in the media, very quiet. It seemed like, this is probably revisionist history on my end, but it even seemed like some of that entourage was gone. It felt like he was like going back to basics. And I know he's always hung his hat on like being like a true martial artist and respectful. It felt like he went back to that. And I was scared shitless going into it because that made me, I was like, uh-oh.
I felt like he was dangerous again. Like this, obviously always dangerous, but like we said before, like that weight is off his shoulders. He can be free. He can be loose and have fun. And now he has a purpose again. Like, hey, what the hell? This is my belt. I'm going to go take it. Yeah, it was very concerning.
I absolutely agree. It's that thing where for all those years, it's just like fight the next contender up, especially when he's getting to these lower level contenders like Weidman was at the time. What's the motivation for him? He's got all the motivation in the world now, and it seems like it's really kind of getting to him.
That's right. So the rematch was set for UFC 168 in Las Vegas. And as you said, Silva appeared confident and comfortable, even bouncing up and down on his way to the cage. And the buzz inside the MGM Grand was electric. And when the fight began, Silva looked good, popping up immediately after Weidman's first takedown. After that, Silva secured a hold around Weidman's neck, driving knees into his body, reminiscent of his fight with Rich Franklin. Not
you almost
Rick.
did it
I
again?
almost did it again.
My back.
But Weidman launched heavy punches over the top and managed to trip Silva in the process. And for the rest of the first round, Weidman remained on top of Silva as he had in their first fight. But this was the way it had been, as I said, with Chael in their fights, the way it had been with Dan Henderson, and the way it had been with Weidman. So this was expected. Round two was where the mystery was. In round two, Silva had finished Chael. He had finished Henderson.
Yushin Okami.
Yushin Okami was round two. That's right. So in round two, anything could happen, but no one could have imagined what happened next. At just over 1 minute into the second round, Silva planted his left leg and threw a hard kick aimed at Weidman's thigh. When Weidman saw the kick coming, he angled his knee out to check the kick. And when he did, Silva's leg snapped in half, sending his foot and ankle out around Weidman's leg. Silva promptly fell to the ground, writhing in pain, screaming at the top of his lungs.
Was that like that? Sounded like a
difficult to read.
That sounded like a portion of one of your horror novels. The end there, just like screaming in pain.
I did rewatch this, and it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. It goes up there with was it like the Duke basketball player a couple of years ago had the same thing where, all of a sudden your leg's made out of rubber and you're witnessing someone be literally in the worst pain they will ever be in their entire lives. It's horrifying.
Yeah, that was MMA so fucking crazy. That was such an awesome card, awesome night. As a Weidman fan, it was so exciting after the first round. Then that horrifying scene ensued. Got all the casuals there like, what the fuck did you guys invite us over for? Like, there's just a leg snapped in half.
It's such a split-second thing, too.
Oh, my God.
He kicks him and falls to the ground, and you don't know what's happening.
And it's so lose-lose because there's definitely skill and strategy, as we will probably touch on during the Weidman episode. Like, it's not like it was a random thing. However, no one wanted a win like that. Even Weidman fans, it was disgusting. It was like shit. I wanted to see him do what he did the first round or take him down. No one wanted that, and it was awful.
Well, so again, not to go too much into the Weidman side of it, but again, this does impact the Anderson legacy here. So again, after that first fight, in one of the first interviews with Longo, right after the fight, they asked him how he felt about everything and his guy winning the title and dethroning the greatest of all time, possibly. And the very first thing he says is he took too many kicks. He took too many leg kicks. So right away, the night of the fight, they had identified he's getting kicked too much. Now, if you remember, back when Anderson's repertoire was a little bit limited, one of the issues he had was he was telegraphing his kicks. He wasn't hiding them like he needed to so you could see them coming. So Weidman spends nearly, a significant portion of his camp doing this check called the Destroyer. and they prepared to break Anderson's leg. It was apparently, I don't remember, because again, it's been a few years, but I think he actually broke someone's leg with it in practice. Like, this was something they had worked on, and the whole goal is to get, the narrowest part of his shin to hit the biggest part of your knee or your shin, closer to your knee as possible, and it can break it. Well, it did. So to the mainstream public, it looks like it was fluky, and the perception of it is that it was a fluke. I'm not sure this one was. I actually think this is less fluky than the first one where Anderson's fucking around, because he planned for this for 6 months, and it worked.
Yeah, it's just so weird that a defensive move can end a fight.
But
I don't recall any other time. And I'm not saying it wasn't.
If you listen to coaches speak on checking kicks, they actually say the exact thing. They go, it's not defense. They go, it's offense. They go, you're trying to break his leg.
I understand that. I just mean the perception
exactly.
is that you're stopping an offensive move with defense, but that defense is in effect an offensive move. So it's just bizarre because, look, if you're not on the inside of this sport, on the inside, you don't understand that, one. And two, even if you understand it, you still can't believe that you're witnessing it. Yep. You still can't believe what you're seeing. The guy's, like you said, Jake, the guy's foot looked like it was rubber. It extends out in a way that it's not supposed to. And I want to say, and I'm going off memory here, that his bone shattered or broken half, and it's jagged in there, and when the foot swung around, he almost severed his ligaments.
I was just gonna say that, like, he kicks obviously with enough force to break his own leg, and the rest of his axe is like a lever and a fulcrum, and it's whipping around with a sharp bone in there. Like, it's just horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, he almost was gonna never walk again or never use that leg again. This is a guy who spends his entire life using his legs and his arms to fight other men in a cage, and then he comes close to losing his leg. And I said it last episode, and I'll just reiterate it. I cannot imagine having this horrifying experience, like getting attacked by a shark or breaking your leg, and then deciding that you want to get back inside the octagon again.
Yeah, there's that champion spirit.
That's the most insane thing in the world to me.
That memory of him laying there screaming is like ingrained in my head.
Especially like Weidman runs over to like check on him and make sure he's okay, and Silva's in far too much pain to register anything. He's just yelling and holding his leg.
I think he was still screaming on the stretcher when they took him out. He's screaming at the top. This is a guy who takes pain for a living, and this is too much for him to bear. It's brutal.
It just, regarding the fan base and the sport in general, this is just the story of this sport. Like, we talk a lot about like the snowball effect. This Anderson's career is about to be a snowball going in the wrong direction. We're going down the hill right now with this snowball. Well, the UFC has this problem where every time they get momentum, something goes wrong. Whether it's the biggest draw gets hurt, leaves, whatever. This was their chance to pass the torch. Anderson was going to pass the torch. It hadn't gone. Had not promoted Weidman correctly, but he was promoting himself here. He's doing crazy things to Anderson Silva, and they just can't catch a break. Because even catching Anderson clowning around the first time, that's a cool story. That's like the underdog catching the arrogant guy who had gotten full of himself, right, is one way to look at it. The second one, the general public doesn't understand what happened. They're horrified. I mean, you think of all the women that were over that night watching the fight. They were horrified. Everyone was horrified, but casuals or people who weren't really sold on UFC anyway. Yeah. And it hurts the momentum because they don't want anything to do with it. And I just feel like this is that curse of the sport, right? Whether fights drop out, whatever, people don't make weight. This is another one of those moments. This was a huge night. It was Ronda Misha. Ronda Misha, I think. It was a big Ronda fight, whatever it was. Ronda was in the co-main. And I think it was Ronda Misha too. So it was a mega, mega card. And then it ends that way. And you're like, fuck, man, this poor sport can't catch a break.
Yeah, and poor Anderson. I mean, that is absolutely brutal. And no one wanted to see that happen. So the once indestructible king of the UFC had lost his crown and now was a broken man. After his first loss to Weidman, questions of Silva's ego and age were on people's minds. But now, the question that lingered inside the MGM Grand was, would Silva ever fight again? and it would be hard for anyone to blame him if he had chosen not to. If he had chosen to retire and spend more time with his family, that would have been just fine, but Silva vowed to return to the sport he loved, the sport that had given him everything, and once again, he vowed to return stronger. Only this time, he wasn't concerned with regaining his title. This time, he needed a big profile fight against a guy who would be willing to play his game. And that man was Nick Diaz, or so we thought.
Yeah, man. What a bummer. We were so fired up for this fight. This is the goddamn Nick spiral. It looked like it would be fireworks. And within 1 minute, Nick's fucking around, taking the clowning to a crazy level, even that Anderson would be stunned by. I was super bummed. It sucked. I don't know how else to put it. Like, it was cool to see. It was like a super fight in a way because Nick is, I know not by the sense of today, but just at the time seeing those two go at it was awesome, but it was a huge letdown.
Well, we shit all over the UFC for matchmaking and promotional deficiencies and what have you, but this was a perfect pairing. This was Nick Diaz, who has been in scraps in every fight, who will go toe-to-toe with his opponent, who will chase Carlos Condit around the octagon, the guy who will taunt you, but just enough to get you to engage, slap you in the face.
Yes.
He's the guy. There's no threat of a takedown. He's the perfect person for Silva to fight upon his return. And it's just weird and bizarre. And Anderson just cannot seem to gain any traction. So Anderson wins the fight by decision, but it was very similar to the Cote thing where people just had a sour taste in their mouth, similar to Lightes.
Yeah.
Those fights.
Well, there's one thing worse than a dog shit fight. It's a 25-minute dog shit fight. Like, that is kind of brutal. Like, it kills all the momentum of the night. Yeah, that's really tough.
Well, that night, Mr. Hayes himself had a parlay going. I don't know if you know this story. A little parlay that made it all the way to the main event. Unfortunately, he had Nick Diaz, and he could have won like $1,000.
Oh,
yeah.
Right.
So that classic Hayes the whole time. He's like, I don't care. I'm like, dude, it's $1,000. Of course you care, dude. But yeah, look, any limitations on Anderson in that fight, anything he didn't do, for me, you can just write it all off as like it was his first fight back after a horrible leg break. If he was timid at all, I get every bit of it, right? It's the first game back after somebody returns from a torn ACL, anything like that. For him to come back from the leg break, I got it. Nick Diaz is the one that let us all down, and that's the thing. We all love the Diaz brothers, and whenever we do those episodes, we have to call it like it is. This is where Nick just starts blowing it, man. Like, he fucked up because that fight should have been awesome.
Yeah, it was unfortunate, and what was even more unfortunate was that Anderson was talking about going to compete in the Olympics and Taekwondo for Brazil.
No.
There was all these weird, again, starting to get in that weird space where he's wanting to do other things. And it happens to all the guys at that level, especially after you've lost 2 in a row. So he wins the Diaz fight. So he's back to winning, which is good. But once again, rumors of a super fight start resurfacing. And Silva's son even went so far as to tweet a picture of GSP and Anderson from an old Taekwondo or Muay Thai sparring session with the hashtag, "It's happening." But just hours later, any hope of a super fight was dashed when the UFC notified the public that Anderson Silva had tested positive for drostanolone. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Now, it was no longer the remainder of Silva's career that fans were worried about, but everything prior.
Oh, boy.
So this is just back and forth it's no one can really get a handle on Anderson Silva at this point.
Well, look, this is a devastating moment because this is, everyone's so desensitized to it now because of USADA and you just tainted supplement. You just get so used to seeing these suspensions, guys come back early. This was catastrophic. This is a guy, everybody thought he was clean. He's not some super muscular. He's not Vitor, right? He's just some, he looks a little soft. You totally think he's clean, and this happens. And then there's the problem that it happens in his first ever random out of competition? It was out of competition test. But the bottom line is he didn't know it was coming. And he fails the first one. Yikes.
Well, this joke is about to go over about as well as an Anderson Silva leg kick.
Oh, no.
Jeez.
All right, I'll see you guys next time. I'm out.
Unbelievable.
Do you think the problem that Silva was listening to too much Godsmack?
Was he listening to Godsmack?
Joe, stand alone.
Okay.
No?
Get
Anyone?
you
No?
said on out.
Okay,
You
I'm
said
out.
on- Oh, no. I got what you're going for. I love everything that just happened. I love everything.
I do not.
I got it. I stand alone.
Last 2 episodes, I gave you plenty of passes because of your mustache, and now you have shaved it, and there are no passes here.
My skin was really dry. I had to hydrate. I had to shave the mustache, and I'm not really feeling it. I feel off my game.
Nope.
So-
You are off your game,
So-
sir.
It felt weird when I was coming up with it.
So we're going to
It makes
mute you
sense.
for about 3 minutes
That's
after
fair.
that.
Penalty box.
Yep, you sit over there.
So yeah, this is not good at all. This is the tail end of the era when these PED tests were referred to as intelligence tests. And he feels the first one he gets that's actually a little bit complicated. It's not a good look at all here. And this is actually, this span of failures, including Anderson's, is what led to the USADA era. It got them thinking. And they've cited this era where they had too many high-profile failures.
Yeah, and what a weird time for Anderson to lose 2 fights in strange fashion, to come back, get the win against Nick Diaz in a bizarre fight. His son wants him to retire after that fight. He's begging him to retire. Then the next minute, he's tweeting about GSP and Anderson happening. It's going to happen. And then he gets popped for steroids for the Diaz fight. I can't say it enough. Silva is just a roller coaster in and of himself. It's the lowest of the low, and then super fights, and then back down to failed test. You just can't get a handle on this guy, no matter how hard you try. You will never get a grasp. We can do 3 hour-and-a-half long episodes on Anderson Silva, and you'll still walk away really not knowing who this guy is.
Well, especially at this point in his career, too, because he has the first loss to Weidman, which can be considered fluky. You know, he got caught clowning. It happens. We have the second, which definitely to a lot of people can also be considered a huge fluke, you know, like we stated before. And then we have this win that gets overturned. So, you know, like it is a roller coaster, but at this point, you know, is the old Silva could be 1 fight away to just completely dominating. Sure, he had some fluky losses to Weidman. There's this thing with Diaz, but right now is kind of the tipping point for him.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you can't entirely write him off because you haven't seen a drastic decline in his skills at this point, but you also can't have any confidence in him because he's essentially lost his last 3 fights. So it really is bizarre. And I can't recall another sport or another athlete where this is the case.
Well, you know, hindsight's 20/20, but you know, if you look back at the time, a lot of experts say that even you know that reign, a lot of part 2, the second half of that episode, there were a lot of red flags, and I painted it in our episode kind of like they were writing the blueprint. But things were happening with Anderson. You know, there are questions if he was slowing down. You know, obviously the Chael complete destruction. You know, Chael is a good fighter, but Chael's more of like a gatekeeper, and he fucking smashed Anderson for 23.5 minutes, and then another round he smashed him. There's a lot of even in the Bonner fight, a lot of people say he took too many punches. It didn't matter, he was okay, but they're like, God, how is he getting hit by Bonner of all people? But all you remember is that flashy knockout. But over time, it's building up, and I think that's why when you get to the Weidman fight, you see the -200 because Vegas and the experts see what's going on. He might truly be slowing down. And I know a lot of the stuff seemed fluky, but then when he ran into the wrong person with the wrong camp, he got totally exposed. He's not the same person. And now, on top of this, when he finally gets a win against somebody like Diaz, he fucking pops for PEDs. So now we're seeing this fucking total downfall. He's diminishing and popping for PEDs.
Yeah, so he was issued a 1-year suspension for the failed drug test, and this would mark the lowest point in Silva's career. But Silva swore by his innocence, and he promised to return to fighting once his suspension was served. So 1 month after it was served, Silva stepped back into the octagon, this time to face the brash Englishman, Michael Bisping.
Can we double back for a moment?
Yeah.
Because I feel that this is important. We have to go over his fucking phenomenal excuse for the PEDs
Go for
and
it.
what we think he should have done.
Yes.
Okay, Jake, do you know what his excuse was by chance?
I could guess because it's the same line everyone
A
else.
little male enhancement? A little...
Oh,
Hey-o.
a little bit of the old tiger balm.
Didn't he get it from some, like, and what was the
Like a
story? It
gas
was some
station,
guy
I
in, like,
assume?
Thailand or
A
some
guy
shit?
in Thailand. Yep.
You want to run through this? I mean, I love
No,
it.
yeah, that's all. That's it. He just said he got it from someone in Thailand, and it was a sexual performance drug.
Oh. Okay.
Not enhancement.
Oh,
but
I'm sorry.
I mean, same thing, but
Do you think his wife hit him with that? I'm not impressed with your performance.
Oh,
line?
my goodness. It's not rolling it out.
you've redeemed yourself from your
Andy's
last joke,
back.
sir. Thank
He's
you.
back
Well, we're
in
gonna
the-
edit that previous joke
Yeah.
out. I'm back. I'm back.
I'm back. Yeah, so he goes over this insane, dick pill from Thailand excuse, very bold strategy. And we're all sitting there, even the Anderson haters going like, dude, just say you used it to help with your recovery on your leg and stuff. Like, we would totally be cool with that, There's got to be some exemption or something he could have got to help with his leg. No.
I want to thank Anderson for giving me my next excuse next time I fuck up. Is just 100% going to be like, well, to be fair, it was a dick pill I got from Thailand. So,
Sir, yeah, why? These excuses on these PEDs are insane. So, yeah, I just wanted to make sure we got that out there.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that was against the better advice of his team, but he decided to roll with that reason, I guess, excuse, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, he's back to fighting, and he's going to face Bisping. And Bisping seemed like, much like Diaz, the perfect opponent for his return because he would stand and engage with Silva in the center of the octagon, the same way Forrest had, the same way we thought Diaz was going to. And Bisping did that, but he proved to also be more than Silva anticipated.
I was bitching and moaning about this booking hardcore because I'm like, oh, they're handpicking his opponents. Which, by the way, hey, Tim, grow up. That's called promoting, and that's what they should do to protect him. It's what they're doing in boxing right now with Manny Pacquiao. They're giving him safe, big names that he can beat, build his name back up, and then they can weasel their way into another Floyd fight eventually or something, and everybody makes a ton of money. Because if Manny wins just enough fights in a row, it looks legit. This is what they're doing here with Anderson.
Well, and simultaneously, they're just trying to get the guy back on track.
Right.
They're
They're doing a great job.
The greatest fighter to ever compete in some people's mind is on a 3-fight skid with a steroid test failed. You just got to get him back.
Yes. So they're killing it with this promotion. And again, I was being a child as usual, but they nailed this. It was interesting that he had to go to London. Did he? No, he wanted to do the rematch in Brazil. I don't think he was happy about going to London to do it. But man, the fight lived up to the hype. It was it was awesome, actually. Bisping comes out, kind of stuns everybody by winning the first 2 rounds. And then the end of round 3 happens. If you want to go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, well, so Jake had not watched this fight prior to recording, so we showed him before we started here. And it was a chance for me to watch it once again because I hadn't seen it since the night it aired. And you forget. So just to set the stage, if you haven't seen the fight, as Tim said, Bisping is winning the fight up until the 3rd round. And finally, Silva starts to turn it on right towards the end. And he hits Bisping with a couple combos, backs him up to the fence, and knocks Bisping's mouthpiece out. Well, Bisping, there's a little quick break in the action where Silva steps back to reset, and Bisping decides to point to his mouth guard to indicate it to Herb Dean to stop the action. Well, Herb does not call a timeout, so Silva sees Bisping backed up against the cage and decides to throw a beautiful flying knee right into Bisping's chin and knock Bisping. He just goes crumbling to the canvas. Silva raises his arms, turns, and walks away right as the bell ends. So it's weird because Silva thinks he's won. He jumps up on the other side of the octagon. He's celebrating. He's doing his typical thing. Again, very emotional. He's come back from all of these things and thinks he has just had another highlight reel knockout of Michael Bisping, overcoming adversity in the first 2 rounds, and jumps up on the cage to celebrate. But the fight wasn't over.
I had like a very visceral reaction to that. Like I felt like it was so over the top that it was like he was doing it on purpose. Like it was almost like he was trying to get them to call the fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and no doubt I felt the same way watching it. It's just crazy that when we're doing this research and we're reiterating these devastating losses and he's fallen so low. As you said, when he loses, there's this weight off his shoulder. He's fallen so low. He's trying to make his way back. He's come back from a broken leg. He's come back from steroid allegations and convictions. And now he finally has a highlight reel knockout. Maybe he really did think he won. Maybe he was just overwhelmed with emotion because in future fight, we'll cover here in a minute, he falls to, I think actually in the Diaz fight, he fell to his knees after the decision was read, crying into his hands. He never did that in a regular fight, much less a fight after it's not for a title or anything. So he's overwhelmed with emotion at that point, and then in a future fight, he's overwhelmed with emotion again. So it's possible. It is possible.
I gotcha. It was weird to me, but look, ultimately, you're still going, hey, they're saying the fight's not over. We still got 2 more rounds to go. You're thinking Bisping's fucked. Like, you got 1 minute to recover.
He got drilled.
Yeah. I mean, you're like, there's no way. This feels like one of those injuries, like things you don't come back from. And yet, that 4th round starts. Bisping wins the 4th round. Anderson wins the 5th round. But the reason I'm going to close out this part of the fight because I want to talk about you, Taylor. They read the decision. Bisping wins. Controversial. A lot of people think he won. Dana White doesn't. But I remember thinking, we were texting at the time. I think you were watching it with Zach, maybe.
I was, yes.
And
we were at my place.
I was convinced, not in a negative way, I was convinced you were going to say Anderson won. I was convinced. And you were like, no, he lost. And you were like upset about it.
Yeah, very emphatically he lost, yes.
And it's a very distinct moment for me because for me, that was the night where like Anderson, in a way, I don't know, you're an Anderson diehard, but he sort of lost you in a way. You were frustrated that night for the first time.
Well, that was if you want to take the 2 seconds in the Chris Weidman fight where you asked me, how did I feel about him overselling that? And it aggravated me for 2 seconds. This was an extrapolation of that over 2 rounds. Look, the fight was not called off. It was not over. Get down off the cage, reset, adrenaline dump, whatever you want to say. It does not matter. Your opponent got knocked out and now has to continue. And Anderson looked hesitant. He was not committing to stuff. He looked lost. He looked like he was convinced he had won the fight, and now he was just going to ride the other 2 rounds out. We say it a lot of times where a fighter is down on the scorecards. He knows it. His team knows it. And then they're not going for it. They're just standing around. They're not throwing their everything into it. And you're scratching your head going, what are you doing? You know you've lost 2 of 3. So you've got to win the last 2 rounds or just finish the damn fight. The guy's 1 punch away from being loopy again.
Yeah.
Go after him.
I was going to say, this is, different sport, but it sort of reminds me of Wilder Fury, where like the 12th round where he drops Fury and you go, oh, well, there's no way. Like he gets back up and you go, there's no way he's going to last 2 more minutes with Wilder. And yet the thing is, there's the difference is that Wilder goes after him and Fury clocks him. And Wilder staggers back and you can see him be like, oh shit, I got to respect this. That changed the last 2 minutes and the future of the sport. They're going to have to fight again. It changes everything. In this one, Anderson never really goes for it and he allows Bisping to do what he's best at and just sort of sit there and outbox him a little bit and recuperate. So that's the fuck up. You're dead on. I wish he would have gone after him. Well, not really because I don't really like Anderson, but if you're an Anderson fan or in his corner, go after him.
And on my side, if there's anyone in the world I want to see lose besides Silva, it's Michael Bisping. So this was actually Silva's opportunity to turn me into a fan. So
he botched it.
Well, if you want to hear that story from Michael Bisping's side, you can listen to our episode on Michael Bisping, and maybe, Jake, you'll become a fan of Bisping.
There are some phenomenal impressions. Phenomenal air quotes.
Ooh, I think I remember that, yes. So Silva was now 0-3-1 in his last 4 fights with steroids linked to his name and legacy. And there seemed to be no way Silva could redeem himself in the eyes of fans or the UFC. But just 4.5 months later, 48 hours before UFC 200, Silva would do one of the most memorable things in his entire career.
Well, here we go again with John Jones, our boy. We can't avoid him, right? So that was going to be awesome. DC John Jones 2, and 2 days before, John Jones pops, as usual. Oh, 3 days, sorry. Thank you, Taylor. 3 days before, pops for PEDs, the fight's off. I mean, it just took all the wind out of everybody's sails. We were devastated. That was the fight everyone was truly excited for, and it's gone. And then this weird rumor pops up because, keep in mind, a couple months prior, Anderson was supposed to fight Uriah Hall, and he got something with his gallbladder. I don't remember.
Yeah, he had an inflamed or enlarged gallbladder and opted to have gallbladder surgery.
So he has surgery. Mm-hmm. So he's literally injured on the couch doing absolutely nothing. And all of a sudden, this weird rumor starts where he's like, I'll fight Cormier. And we're all like, yeah, okay, whatever. And all of a sudden, Anderson's in, Vegas, and they're like moving ahead with his medicals. And we start talking. We're like, holy shit, are they going to make this fight? Is this going to happen? And it did. He fucking steps in on 2 days' notice, off the couch, fights a guy who's tailor-made to beat him, who's not only are they moving up to 205 here, but Cormier is like a heavyweight at 205. So this guy's a giant compared to him.
I think Anderson weighed in at 198 pounds, I want to say.
Yeah.
So 7 pounds short of the 205 limit. Cormier dropped down probably from 240 down to 205.
This is the moment for me. If Anderson sort of, quote unquote, loses you in the Bisping fight, this is where I actually start to respect Anderson a little bit here as a hater, because I'm like, man, because I can make the case, a lot of those late notice fights where he fights Bonner and helps out here or there, it felt like it was very calculated. This is just him sacrificing himself for the greater good of the UFC, and fucking good for him, man. That's insane. And I'll always remember him for that. We all knew he had no fucking chance against Daniel Cormier.
And look, the haters of Anderson Silva will say this was a money grab. UFC 200, one of the biggest cards. This was Anderson vying for another paycheck. And look, you can make that claim if you want to, but we just spent the last 45 minutes explaining that Anderson Silva was on this dramatic downhill run and needs anything to get back in the win column. And he decides to go fight, like you said, a guy who's preparing for the biggest fight of his entire career, a former Olympic wrestler in a heavier weight class. He decides to go fight that guy just for a paycheck. I'm not buying it.
And to be honest, I mean, I wasn't rooting for him, but I had no, if he had won, I would not have been upset, because I was so like, I was amazed that he took the fight. And then, Cormier fights the safe fight, takes him down, very conservative, which I understand. He had to do that. But then that was at the third round, Anderson kicks him one time, and fucking Cormier's hurt. He fucked him up in like the one small opening he had. And it's like a theme in all these fights. Like every time, like the Bisping knee, where you're like, God, it's still there. There's still those flashes. And that's what makes this so complicated.
Well, you said it in episode 1, I believe, or maybe it was episode 2. That's the thing with Silva. He's not indestructible. So it makes his fights fun to watch, because he can lose, but you also know that in one split second, he can end it all. So he can get taken down 2 rounds in a row and get his face pounded in, and then one kick can literally change it all.
And he had fucked him up. Cormier said it hurt him really bad.
He winced really bad when he kicked him. And one thing I want to note here too, Cormier, you said, Cormier did the safe thing. He took him down. Cormier fought his fight, and he took the fight on short notice too. He was preparing for a completely different fighter in John Jones, and now he's on 48 hours notice, got to change his game plan to fight Anderson Silva. He did everything he could do. And talk about a huge adrenaline dump for him. Devastating news, finding out that you're not going to fight. Very emotional stuff. He says it in the post-fight interview. But the fact that he didn't finish Anderson Silva, when he has finished guys at heavyweight, when he has finished guys at light heavyweight, the fact that Anderson survived 3 rounds is a feather in his cap.
Yeah,
it really
absolutely.
is.
Yeah, that was fucking crazy.
And what's wild about that is after the fight, the audience cheered Silva.
Yeah.
So in a way, even though he'd lost yet another fight, he had won back some favor in the eyes of the fans. And now he found himself at a crossroads. Continue his momentum of good favor by getting a win in his next fight and continue to press forward from there, or lose a 5th fight in a row and be forced to consider retirement. Luckily for Silva, he would win his next fight, and I do mean luckily. But Silva's luck wouldn't last long. You see, after the win, Silva was offered a fight against former welterweight Kelvin Gastelum in China, a chance to advance the UFC's popularity there, and a chance to position himself as a possible number 1 contender for the title. But the fight would never happen. Just 2 weeks before the fight was set to take place, it was reported that Anderson Silva had been flagged for steroids for a second time.
So this, all right, you guys are obviously familiar with the gem, the butterfly effect, obviously.
Absolutely.
Fucking, this just feels like that. This feels like one thing went wrong and we keep trying to fix it and go down different paths, and it just keeps spiraling out of control. Every time you think you have something figured out, it gets worse. Just when I thought, maybe that is not he's a good guy. He got off the couch, fought Daniel Cormier. He was doomed, and he still took that fight. He's a good guy, and I hate Gastelum, so I'm rooting for him against Gastelum. Then he fucking pops again for PEDs, and I'm like, dude, really?
Well, what was his dick pill situation this time?
That's true. Is this just the dick pills again, Taylor? Or
no, this time it was a contaminated substance.
Oh, my
from
favorite.
A Brazilian supply company.
Oh,
hey now.
Okay, so so this time we kept it.
It's like
in
a
Brazil.
Brazilian manufacturing plant that provided his supplements that did not list the banned substances on the label that he was taking.
This is where things we've completely spiraled out of control at this point. This is where he just needs to. You wish he would have gone with his son's advice and retired, because now his legacy is fought. This is where he truly lost you in a way.
He did, and it's such a fine line. You're great for so long. You lose. People are telling you it's a fluke. You get a win. There's reasons to hang on, right? There's reasons to keep going. Maybe you do what you did at UFC 200. He's gotten back some of that momentum.
Hey, man, there's always a Robbie Lawler story, right? There's always somebody who's down and out and that has the full comeback. He all the way to a full-on title reign. You never know.
But at this point, he's all in. And the crazy part is the UFC was still doing him favors. They were still giving him a chance to fight in China. That market is gigantic, or would be gigantic. And Silva was the guy they were kind of pushing out there to go, here's our representation. Here's what we want to represent us in your country.
Yep.
Pushing him to the front of the line for a second, third time, trying to get him back in a middleweight title fight. And he does this. It's so disappointing. It really is.
That was tough. That felt like a somewhat, probably ill-advised to think this way, but it felt like a winnable fight at the time. And he does that, and now it's the 2. And I know he got off with the tainted supplement thing, but man, at the time when he put up his first post about it, he didn't even deny it. He's just like, we're going to work this out. And you're like, oh boy, you'd think somebody who is the Michael Jordan of the sport, who pops a second time if he's not really cheating, would be freaking out. Like, I'm clean. He's just kind of like, we're going to figure this out. Thanks for hanging with me. It's just weird.
I think Goldie proved that Travis Lutter was a Michael Jordan.
My bad.
Gorgeous.
Hey, you ready for this, Jake? This is going to blow your mind. This excuse was somehow better than the dick pill one. I know you don't think that's possible, but this one worked. That's
old Trusty, the tainted supplement excuse.
I don't know how Taiwanese gas station supplements didn't get him, or dick pills did not get him off.
That's what I'm saying. If that didn't work, how the hell did this work? But it did. So he said in his own words, was vindicated.
Just like John Jones has been vindicated.
I don't want to mention those two in the same sentence, but Silva's legacy was forever tarnished. The man who had at one time stood above all his peers, the greatest of all time, was now on a run of 1 4-1 with 2 PED suspensions. We're just adding them up here. So this was, by all accounts, the end for Anderson Silva, the coup de grace. Surely there was no coming back from this. Then, as we've come to expect by this point in Silva's story, things took another turn. The UFC announced that Silva was coming back, and a win over his next opponent would catapult him to the front of the line in the middleweight division. This is the third or fourth time. One win, and he would be right back in line for the title. How could this be? How did Silva deserve such royal treatment at this point? Sure, he had done great things for the sport, but the UFC didn't owe him anything, and certainly they didn't owe him this. Well, the truth is, it had less to do with Silva than it did with his opponent. See, Silva wasn't exactly being rewarded with an unearned path to the title. Instead, he was getting the one thing he had asked for 5 years earlier at the height of his reign. He was getting a fight with his clone.
Well, all right. So first of all, there's again a lot to unpack here. Like you said, a guy is now being offered a potential title shot. I know it's not about Anderson. It's about Stylebender. We got a guy who's 1-4-1 in the past, 6 years? His one win, which we barely even mentioned, it was like a throwaway comment by you, was the Brunson win, which the vast majority of the people think he lost. And he is now being offered a title shot if he can beat Stylebender. That being said, we know why there's this stipulation on this fight. It's all about Stylebender. And now we can kind of go over. So is the title shot bullshit? Yeah, it is. I get it though. I mean, it'll make Whitaker a made man, right? Like he's already kind of a bigger name. He's going to sell out in Australia. And now if he fights Anderson, it'd be a really big deal. But this is all about Stylebender. So Anderson is now we've come full circle. He's being sacrificed for the youth.
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack here. I mean, we did kind of breeze through the Brunson thing. Silva does get a win against Brunson, and I've made very clear that was a lucky win. I say that only because most people think Brunson won that fight, including myself. When I was watching the fight, I thought Brunson won it 2-1. So two rounds and then one for Silva. But Silva got the win, and it was actually a unanimous win. And again, that's the fight I alluded to earlier where he gets extremely emotional picking up the win. So once again, kind of just a little bit of momentum back. And then now it's weird. The UFC sort of gives him this backhanded kind of reward. Here you go. We'll give you a shot at the title, but you got to beat this guy, the younger version of you.
See,
good luck.
That's why I love doing these stories, though, because if you look at on paper, it's like, why the fuck is Anderson Silva possibly getting a title shot? And look, he's probably not going to get it. We can go over that. But when you look at the full story and you see what he did for them at events like UFC 200 and when he fought Bonner and stepped in and saved them, if they would just come out and be like, hey, man, we owe this guy one. He's a legend. This is his last chance, and we're going to make him fight his clone. We're going to make him fight the new version of himself, and if he can beat him, what a crazy story that would be. But again, they have similar fight styles, and everyone's screaming in the commercials, and come watch somebody get knocked out. Sorry.
Jake, have you seen Stylebender fight?
I have not.
Holy shit.
So I guess,
so
yeah.
What's Stylebender's real name?
Israel Adesanya.
Yeah, good.
Okay. All right. I'm just checking because
he's a what would you call him? He's not K1, but
just the kickboxing.
Yeah,
he's
had a career in kickboxing and the stand up.
Again, this isn't his episode or anything, but the book on him has been like, yeah, but what about a wrestler? A wrestler will just take him down. But then he fought Brunson in his last fight and beat the fucking piss out of him. And you're like, okay.
So by contrast, Silva fought Brunson and by all accounts lost, and then Israel fought Brunson.
When
and
you
just
watch him
him
fight, it's like watching the early John Jones fights where you're like, oh, Jesus, like this is something. And you never know. You never know if he's going to get up to a certain level and get shown that he has severe limitations. But it's the same shit you were saying about Anderson. It's pinpoint accuracy, very violent. And now Anderson's got to fight this.
And it'll be interesting to see. Look, no one knows what's going to happen, but all the experts, since we've been talking about what the experts are saying, all the experts say that Silva's only chance is to go back to his ground game, to try to get Stylebender on the ground and use his jiu-jitsu, because on the feet, Stylebender is the old Anderson Silva. He's a quicker, younger, stronger version of Anderson. So on the feet, Anderson really doesn't stand much of a chance, which is crazy to say since at one time he was considered the best striker in the world, but now he's fighting his clone, the younger clone. And so we'll see what happens, but that brings us up to date. That concludes the story of Anderson the Spider Silva, for now anyway. Is there another chapter to Anderson's story? Perhaps. With Anderson, it's best to expect the unexpected. But either way, we'll be watching. Until then, let's discuss our takeaways from this 3-part series. And Jake, I guess we should probably start with you.
Well, I'm a well-documented hater for sure, but going through this whole process, I think I kind of gave Anderson kind of a bum rap from the start. Like I kind of previously mentioned before, we came in and it seemed like he was always on top, because when my fandom really started with the sport, he was the champion, and it seemed like he was so dominant that he had been the champion forever, when really he had been the champion for like 3 months, and then he had a 6-year run. So he was tremendous to watch, and his striking was really something else, but I often found myself rooting against him, especially because, as I mentioned before, he ended up fighting like some of my favorite fighters, Chael, Forrest, Henderson. Like I love all those guys. So I kind of just hated him, and I couldn't wait to see him lose. And then when he did lose, I felt so vindicated, because he was doing that clowning shit that I hate. And I was so happy to see him lose that way. And then the second loss, it was the worst thing ever, and I was so unhappy to see him lose that way. So I guess I've softened on him a little bit. Like he was tremendous, and we were lucky to watch the sport when he was reigning, because there's no one else as brutal and violent as he was at the time. And since John Jones has come up, and now like the dream fight in my head, putting weight classes aside, man, peak John Jones versus peak Silva would have been a hell of a fight. So I guess I've softened a little bit. Still a mild hater, but it's mostly because of that clowning stuff. And he was tremendous.
To me, Anderson, his career and his life, just him in general, he's kind of a lot like the UFC itself in the sport of MMA, right? Like he just like comes along, there's all this potential, all this promise, he's electric, catches everybody's eye. But then over time, it's pretty clear there's some problems with whether it's in the cage, outside of the cage, just like the sport itself. There's issues left and right. And eventually those issues caught up to him. And we can say what we want. We don't know. We don't know if those losses were fluky, if they were not. I personally think that he finally just, enough of the blueprint was written, and it was time for him to fall, and he has not recovered. And I don't think the style Bender fight's going to be any different. Just like the UFC has fallen into a bit of a rut. Buy rates are down. They're switching over to ESPN. I know they're saying everything's great. They've got all this money, but just like Anderson, the UFC's in a weird spot, and so it's kind of weird that he represents the sport that he fights in a strange way. But overall, super complicated guy. Like you said, I'm just glad we got to be around to see him during that run, because, like I said in the first part, it was cool because he had those limitations. He isn't the God mode. He literally could lose at any time. I think it was Travis Luter who said Anderson Silva is the luckiest fighter to ever step into the octagon. I'm not saying I agree with that. That's an interesting take. I know, Taylor, that's one of the issues you have with John Jones. There's so many comparisons between the two. It's crazy. But you say John Jones should have lost, a couple times. The arm of Vitor, the Gustafsson fight. So is he the luckiest fighter to ever step in the octagon? I don't believe that. But I do believe that there were a lot of times he could have lost, and that's what made it so exciting. So overall, crazy story, crazy career. And, I wouldn't say I'm rooting for him against Stylebender. I just hope he doesn't get embarrassed. You know what I mean?
So for me, there's a bunch of different ways I could take this, but just to keep it concise here and use some brevity, I'll just say this. Going into this episode or this 3-part series, of course I am a diehard Anderson Silva fan, and I always will be, because I do appreciate what I got to witness. He was the person that brought me back into the sport. He was the person that I held up for other people to see when I wanted them to come into the sport. He was electric. He was magical. There were things he did that defied reason, and it was a blast to watch. And I'm sad it's over. That being said, I learned a little bit more about Anderson Silva, the person, through this. And I haven't concluded that Anderson is a bad person. I actually genuinely do think he's a good guy. But I think that there's some character flaws there that started to seep out later on when he did lose. There's some things that happened. Obviously, the steroid stuff. It's tough because you want to believe the best about him. There's a lot of comparisons with Jon Jones, but one thing I'm thankful for is that Anderson hasn't had the out-of-the-cage stuff that Jon Jones has had. And that
minus the shotgun, sir.
Well, that was before
Ignore
the UFC. Don't worry about it. So, Jake, what was that whistle all about?
Nothing. Just ignore it.
So, anyway, I'm happy that he's not tied to any extracurricular stuff outside of the cage, minus the one shotgun incident.
That's it.
But all that said, I agree with you. We just need to be thankful we got to watch him fight. And if you do hate Anderson Silva after listening to this, prior to listening to this, that's totally fine. You don't have to like the guy. But if you can't appreciate what he did during his run, there's something wrong. Because one of the big complaints about this sport is that it's boring at times. And as you said, Tim, it was never boring with Anderson Silva. It never was.
Well, that's the thing, man, is you're right. It was exciting. And we, as fans, I've done this my whole life. I brought this up before where I don't appreciate greatness as it's happening. I brought it up the last episode with Michael Jordan, and then I eventually realized my mistake. We were all guilty of this during Anderson's run, like we said, where a lot of those fluky fights, we did not enjoy them. We need to do better with that. I do my best right now to enjoy every Jon Jones fight. Even though I hate him, I make a point of going, we're seeing maybe the greatest of all time. It's time to just appreciate it. A lot of people do it with LeBron James. LeBron James is very possibly the greatest basketball player of all time, and people are too busy still talking about Miami, talking about the greatness of the Warriors, and it's like, yeah, but there's the greatest right over there, by the way. This guy might have been the best. It's a tough debate. There's too much stuff going on inside and outside the cage with people like him and Jon Jones to really figure out who's better than who. But the bottom line is we just saw an all-timer, man, and he's very, very complicated. I'm very glad we did this because, like I said, like you said, stuff all the way from the shotgun story all the way to this crazy downfall. There is so much that people need to know. I didn't know the half of that childhood stuff was insane. And
yeah, we just did 4.5 hours on Anderson, and we held back a lot of stuff because it bleeds over into Chael's episode or it bleeds over into Weidman's episode. There's so much there. It's pretty incredible. The guy is a complete enigma, but he's also fascinating at the same time. And I'll tie it back to the first episode. He is a real artist, and sometimes that can lead you down crazy paths, but that is Anderson Silva.
He proved that with the Jabberwockies mask.
That's right, he did. All right, well, two men fighting inside a steel cage isn't for everyone, but stories like Anderson Silva's are. This is MMA Untold, and if you didn't know, now you know.
It's dark and hell is hot. Ain't no sunshine when it's on. Only darkness every day. Ain't no sunshine when it's on, cause when it's on, you niggas know the beat gone every time, cause we don't play. Who turn out the lights is what niggas be saying. Now you don't wanna fight, but y'all niggas be playing. Thinking it's alright, keep playing with that bow. And you gon' know tonight when you land in that hole. Dirt getting tough.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for everything. Thank you. This is great time for me. I respect you people. Thank you.